Big Four, Anti-Bribery and Corruption, ABC, Interview Preparation. Welcome back to the channel. Today we're diving into anti-bribery and corruption interviews commonly used across Big Four advisory and forensic teams. These questions come from real interview patterns across Big Four firms and global capability centers. ABC work focuses on preventing bribery, identifying misconduct, and investigating improper payments across third parties, employees, and high-risk markets. Let's begin. How do you assess bribery and corruption risk when onboarding a new third-party vendor? Sample answer. I begin by screening the vendor for ownership structure, geographic exposure, sanctions, litigation history, and political connections. I assess the nature of services, payment terms, unusual commission structures, and whether the vendor interacts with government officials. I assign a risk rating and determine whether enhanced due diligence is required. While answering, always talk about ownership transparency, geography risk, payment red flags, and risk scoring. End. A whistleblower alleges that a sales manager paid kickbacks to secure contracts. How do you investigate? Sample answer. I start with structured interviews and review of emails, chats, and expense claims. I analyze unusual payments, discounts, side agreements, or round sum transfers to intermediaries. I compare contract margins with historical patterns to detect anomalies. While answering, always talk about interviews, transaction testing, communication review, and anomaly analysis. How do you design a risk-based due diligence framework for third parties and agents? Sample answer. I segment third parties into low, medium, and high risk based on service type, geography, and government touchpoints. For each tier, I define checks like sanctions screening, beneficial ownership verification, financial health checks, and on-site assessments. I document triggers for ongoing monitoring. While answering, always talk about segmentation, tiering, verification steps, and monitoring triggers. End. A company operates in high-risk jurisdictions. How do you perform corruption risk mapping? Sample answer. I assess country-level corruption indices, enforcement strength, political exposure, and sector risk. Then I map business activities in each region, procurement, licensing, sales agents, to identify high vulnerability areas. The output is a heat map that guides controls and monitoring. While answering, always talk about jurisdiction indicators, business activity mapping, exposure points, and heat maps. How do you identify red flags that indicate potential bribery in procurement processes? Sample answer. I look for single-source purchases, repetitive awards to the same vendor, inflated pricing, rushed approvals, and missing competitive bids. I test for unusual PO invoice patterns, split invoices, or conflicts of interest. While answering, always talk about procurement anomalies, approval patterns, price irregularities, and conflict indicators. A vendor offers consulting fees with no clear scope. How do you assess bribery risk? Sample answer. I review contract documentation, scope justification, deliverables, and market rates. If unclear, I examine background of vendor, links to officials, and rationale for using them. I test payment timing around key contracts. While answering, always talk about scope clarity, vendor credibility, linkage checks, and payment timing. How do you evaluate the effectiveness of a company's ABC compliance program? Sample answer. I assess policies, training, tone at the top, third-party controls, approval workflows, and monitoring mechanisms. I test whether controls actually work through sampling and exception review. I benchmark the program against FCPA, UKBA, and international guidelines. While answering, always talk about policy review, control testing, training assessment, and benchmarking. A client wants to comply with FCPA, UK Bribery Act, and PCA. How do you harmonize compliance requirements? Sample answer. I compare definitions of bribery, facilitation payments, books and records requirements, strict liability standards and penalties. I design a unified global policy that meets the highest standard across all laws. Then, I create risk-based local procedures. While answering, always talk about legal comparison, harmonization logic, global policy design, and local tailoring. How do you investigate facilitation payments disguised as processing fees? Sample answer. I analyze payment descriptors, cash versus digital patterns, rounding, timing around approvals, and employee conversations. I compare fees to standard government rates. Any unexplained premium becomes a red flag for bribery. While answering, always talk about descriptor review, timing tests, benchmark comparison, and red flag escalation. A company hires government officials as consultants. How do you assess corruption exposure? Sample answer. I assess whether the role is legitimate, whether deliverables exist, whether hiring complies with law, and whether the person influences licensing or procurement. I evaluate compensation reasonableness and independence risk. While answering, always talk about legitimacy, conflict checks, regulatory alignment, and compensation analysis. How do you review expense claims for potential bribery indicators? Sample answer. I examine high-risk categories like gifts, hospitality, travel, and entertainment. I test if claims match the business purpose, attendee lists, receipts, and approval trail. Unusual vendors or cash expenses receive depot testing. While answering, always talk about spend categories, documentation review, approval trail, and red flag patterns. A distributor demands unusually high commissions. How do you evaluate bribery risk? Sample answer. I benchmark commission percentages with industry norms, evaluate distributor role, and check if they interact with public officials. I review justification, payment route, and transaction timing around tender wins. While answering, always talk about benchmarking, justification review, official interaction, and payment timing. How do you analyze gifts, entertainment, and hospitality spend for possible abuse? Sample answer. I categorize spend by recipient, frequency, value, and policy thresholds. I test repeat patterns for government officials, year-end spikes, and weak documentation. While answering, always talk about spend profiling, threshold checks, frequency patterns, and recipient analysis. A company provides sponsorships to charities linked to government officials. How do you test legitimacy? Sample answer. I verify the charity's registration, beneficiaries, past activities, and transparency. I check whether sponsorship coincides with contract awards or regulatory approvals. While answering, always talk about legitimacy checks, beneficiary tracing, timing analysis, and linkage to officials. How do you detect red flags in agent or intermediary agreements? Sample answer. I review vague scopes, excessive commissions, unusual termination clauses, and offshore payment instructions. I test background of the agent and assess alignment between contract and actual work performed. While answering, always talk about scope clarity, compensation testing, background checks, and contract-to-activity match. How do you examine books and records to identify hidden bribe payments? Sample answer. I test round sum entries, vague descriptions, unusual expense accounts, cash withdrawals, and vendor proliferation. I reconcile financial records with operational logs. While answering, always talk about descriptor analysis, cash patterns, reconciliation work, and disguised entries. A company expands into a country with weak anti-corruption enforcement. How do you conduct pre-entry risk assessment? Sample answer. I review country corruption indices, legal environment, enforcement track record, licensing hurdles, and political exposure. I map risks to business processes and define mitigation controls. While answering, always talk about jurisdiction indicators, regulatory hurdles, process mapping, and mitigation planning. How do you validate the source of funds in payments made to consultants or intermediaries? Sample answer. I trace payments back to invoices, contracts, and bank routes. I assess whether funds flow into legitimate business accounts or offshore related entities. While answering, always talk about payment tracing, bank route checks, contract linkage, and legitimacy assessment. How do you assess tone at the top regarding anti-corruption culture? Sample answer. I review leadership communication, disciplinary actions, policy enforcement, and resource allocation for compliance. I test whether messages align with actual behavior. While answering, always talk about leadership messaging, enforcement patterns, disciplinary consistency, and resource support. A tender process seems rigged. How do you investigate bid manipulation? Sample answer. I review bid submissions, timestamps, scoring sheets, and evaluator independence. I test similarities in proposals, last-minute changes, and competitor collusion. While answering, always talk about bid document review, timing checks, evaluator independence, and collusion indicators. How do you identify conflicts of interest that may lead to corruption risks? Sample answer. I verify whether employees or their relatives have ownership in vendors, distributors, or agents. I assess approvals, vendor selection behavior, and undisclosed financial relationships. While answering, always talk about ownership linkage, employee declarations, vendor behavior, and disclosure checks. A company's vendor master shows multiple linked entities. How do you investigate beneficial ownership? Sample answer. I perform corporate registry searches, UBO checks, address matching, director overlap, and financial relationship mapping. While answering, always talk about registry checks, UBO tracing, linkage mapping, and address director overlap. How do you evaluate internal controls to prevent bribery and corruption? Sample answer. I assess approval workflows, segregation of duties, due diligence controls, payment controls, and monitoring mechanisms. I test whether controls operate consistently across locations. While answering, always talk about workflow controls, SOD, due diligence steps, and monitoring gaps. A sales team frequently wins deals through relationship-building expenses. How do you classify and test these? Sample answer. I test whether expenses serve legitimate commercial purpose, verify attendees, check policy thresholds, and analyze timing around deal closures. While answering, always talk about business purpose test, attendee validation, threshold checks, and timing analysis. How do you identify political exposure risks in customers or vendors? Sample answer. I screen for PEPs, analyze their roles, evaluate connections to state-owned enterprises, and assess heightened approval needs. While answering, always talk about PEP screening, role assessment, SOE connections, and approval escalation. A client wants to roll out a global ABC policy. How do you customize for region-specific risks? Sample answer. I begin by identifying country-level corruption risks, enforcement strength, cultural sensitivities, and industry-specific vulnerabilities. Then, I map these risks to policy requirements, gift limits, approval thresholds, due diligence depth, and reporting channels. High-risk markets receive stricter controls and enhanced monitoring, while low-risk regions follow standard guidance. While answering, always talk about jurisdiction tailoring, risk mapping, escalation thresholds, and monitoring intensity. How do you assess whistleblower hotline effectiveness in detecting corruption? Sample answer. I review reporting volume, anonymity protections, response timelines, investigation quality, and communication back to whistleblowers. I test whether hotline awareness is strong across employees and third parties. I analyze trends to see whether high-risk areas generate proportionate reports. While answering, always talk about accessibility, response quality, trend analysis, and awareness metrics. A company uses cash-based reimbursements heavily. How do you test for bribery schemes? Sample answer. I evaluate reimbursement patterns, round amounts, repetitive vendors, weak receipts, and vague purposes. I compare spend to approved budgets and business travel norms. I interview employees to understand practices and cross-check with operational records. While answering, always talk about spend profiling, documentation scrutiny, interviews, and benchmark tests. How do you investigate inflated invoices that may conceal bribe payments? Sample answer. I compare invoice amounts to market rates, verify whether services were actually received, and assess vendor legitimacy. I trace payments to bank accounts and check whether funds move to intermediaries or linked parties. While answering, always talk about rate benchmarking, service verification, bank tracing, and vendor legitimacy. A third-party agent has no real business presence. How do you test legitimacy? Sample answer. I check physical address, staff, registration details, tax records, and online footprint. I examine whether the agent has the capacity and expertise required for the service. I review relationships with government officials. While answering, always talk about operational footprint, capacity testing, documentation validation, and political exposure. How do you assess bribery risks in joint ventures and partnerships? Sample answer. I review governance structure, decision rights, approval mechanisms, and historical compliance record of partners. I test whether the JV operates its own ABC controls or relies on parent policies. High-risk partners require enhanced oversight and right-to-audit clauses. While answering, always talk about governance review, partner integrity, control reliance, and oversight mechanisms. A company uses marketing funds to influence public officials. How do you assess violations? Sample answer. I analyze the purpose, recipients, approval process, and evidence of actual marketing activities. I check for disproportionate spend near tender cycles or regulatory approvals. While answering, always talk about purpose testing, spend patterns, approval trail, and timing versus benefits. How do you examine procurement-to-pay cycle for corruption indicators? Sample answer. I test vendor onboarding controls, bidding transparency, PO invoice matching, pricing consistency, and approvals. I look for vendor clustering, unusual bid winners, and sudden price spikes. While answering, always talk about onboarding controls, bid integrity, payment review, and anomaly detection. A suspicious vendor is linked to an employee's relative. How do you address the conflict? Sample answer. I verify the ownership link, assess approval trails, and test whether procurement decisions were biased. I evaluate whether services were fairly priced and actually delivered. Based on findings, I recommend disciplinary steps or vendor removal. While answering, always talk about linkage verification, decision bias assessment, service validation, and corrective action. How do you assess accuracy and completeness of ABC risk assessments? Sample answer. I evaluate methodology, risk criteria, scoring logic, evidence base, and stakeholder inputs. I check whether high-risk functions, markets, and third parties were included. I test historical incidents against risk ratings to detect mismatches. While answering, always talk about methodology review, coverage testing, scoring validation, and incident alignment. A government inspector demanded speed money. How do you guide the client? Sample answer. I emphasize that facilitation payments are prohibited under major anti-corruption laws. I guide the client to document the incident, refuse payment, report internally, and escalate to legal/compliance. I also review related controls to prevent recurrence. While answering, always talk about legal position, documentation, escalation steps, and preventive controls. How do you evaluate adequacy of disciplinary actions for confirmed corruption cases? Sample answer. I assess whether consequences were proportionate, timely, consistent across employees, and communicated clearly. I also check whether remediation included control strengthening and training. While answering, always talk about proportionality, consistency, timeliness, and remediation depth. A due diligence check reveals negative media on a supplier. How do you escalate and evaluate severity? Sample answer. I categorize the issue as minor, moderate, or severe based on credibility, recency, legal findings, and relevance to bribery risks. I escalate severe cases to compliance and legal for enhanced due diligence or rejection. While answering, always talk about severity scoring, credibility assessment, escalation protocol, and enhanced checks. Signing. How do you assess internal audit's role in ABC compliance monitoring? Sample answer. I review audit coverage, sampling depth, exception handling, and follow-up. I assess whether audits target high-risk markets, third parties, and cash processes. I test whether findings translate into real improvements. While answering, always talk about audit scope, risk alignment, sampling quality, and remediation tracking. How do you detect bribery risks in sales incentive structures? Sample answer. I review commission logic, stretch targets, discount authority, and deal approval levels. High or unrealistic incentives may push unethical behavior, so I validate oversight around pricing and customer engagement. While answering, always talk about incentive design, target realism, approval control, and oversight checks. A company has significant cash-based operations. How do you strengthen anti-corruption controls? Sample answer. I implement cash limits, mandatory receipts, surprise audits, segregation of duties, and dual approvals. I encourage digital payments wherever possible to create stronger audit trails. While answering, always talk about SOD, audit trails, cash controls, and digital substitution. How do you evaluate ABC training effectiveness for employees and third parties? Sample answer. I test training frequency, coverage percent, assessments, scenario relevance, and feedback scores. I evaluate whether high-risk groups receive enhanced training and whether behavior improves over time. While answering, always talk about coverage, relevance, testing, and behavior impact. A business reports market development fees without supporting documentation. How do you investigate? Sample answer. I assess contract purpose, review deliverables, test invoice legitimacy, and trace payments. I evaluate whether fees align with economic substance or conceal bribe payments to officials or clients. While answering, always talk about documentation testing, substance over form, tracing, and red flag indicators. How do you assess ABC risks in M&A transactions, pre-deal and post-deal? Sample answer. Pre-deal, I review third-party relationships, government touchpoints, historical red flags, and compliance gaps. Post-deal, I integrate ABC policies, conduct forensic reviews, and remediate inherited risks. While answering, always talk about pre-deal diligence, post-deal integration, inherited risks, and remediation plans. A third party refuses to undergo onboarding due diligence. What actions do you recommend? Sample answer. I classify refusal as a high-risk indicator. I escalate to legal/compliance, suspend onboarding, and assess whether alternatives exist. No engagement should proceed without minimum checks. While answering, always talk about red flag escalation, onboarding suspension, legal involvement, and risk avoidance. How do you test whether high-risk transactions are properly approved and monitored? Sample answer. I sample transactions, check approval levels, validate documentation, and review post-approval monitoring. I test segregation of duties and identify overrides. While answering, always talk about sampling, approval trail, SOD, and override detection. A company provides gifts during festivals. How do you assess compliance with ABC gift policies? Sample answer. I evaluate gift value, frequency, recipients, and business justification. I compare entries to policy thresholds and test whether gifts were provided to government officials. While answering, always talk about threshold tests, recipient analysis, justification, and policy alignment. How do you validate if charitable donations are being used as bribery channels? Sample answer. I review beneficiary legitimacy, donation routing, board approvals, and links between recipients and public officials. I test timing around key regulatory decisions. While answering, always talk about beneficiary testing, linkage checks, approval controls, and timing analysis. How do you prepare ABC investigation findings for regulators or enforcement agencies? Sample answer. I prepare a structured report covering allegations, scope, methodology, evidence, key findings, remedial actions, and management responses. I ensure neutrality, factual accuracy, and legal review. While answering, always talk about structure, evidence strength, neutrality, and remediation. How do you help senior management implement anti-bribery remediation after identified violations? Sample answer. I design corrective actions covering policy updates, control strengthening, training enhancements, disciplinary steps, and sustained monitoring. I support rollout through governance committees and regular reporting. While answering, always talk about corrective actions, governance, monitoring, and culture reinforcement. Thank you for watching, and if you liked our video, kindly press the like button and leave us a comment. This will help us reach a wider audience. Don't forget to check the playlist for more great learning.